Okay, I will. Before I start, are there any questions? So there are three ways you can ask a question. First way is you can type it in the chat box. The second way is you can unmute yourself and just ask a question. Third way is you can raise your hand and then maybe test if you can see who's raising their hands. You can just interrupt me. All right, so I'm assuming there are no questions. Let me share my screen. All right, so can you see everything? Is it good? All right, great. Perfect. So again, not going to repeat this. What are we talking about today? Just a brief introduction of the box of life. I'll introduce you to the red wigglers. These are the earthworms. Briefly describe some of the systems that you can use. And then we'll get into the actual what to feed the worms, how to set up a worm bin, what are some of the maintenance and troubleshooting that you would need if you do start your worm bin. And then last is what do you get out of the system, which is the castings, and how you can use it. So the box of life, I started this about a year ago because I was using a worm bin in my own apartment and for a few years, and I thought that it's such an amazing concept that more people need to be educated about this, and individual action can basically redefine our waste management process. So now imagine instead of having a truck come in, take all your kitchen scraps 30 to 60 kilometers away from the city, compost it in big piles with all the contamination that goes into it. And then what happens, we don't know. Or if in best case, it is composted into good stuff and you're using in your garden, but then all the emissions that are involved in coming, going, the big trucks and taking it away. And that's if your city does have a green bin program like the city of Ottawa does. Most cities don't have that. So all your organic matter is essentially going into landfill. And what happens in landfill is that it starts to decompose without oxygen. So that's an anaerobic process, and that releases methane. So it's a potent greenhouse gas. But I won't talk about the greenhouse gas emissions part of composting. What I think people miss out is that composting is one way that you add organic matter back to the soil. And organic matter is what helps forests grow into forests. It's a natural cycle. And I think living in an urban environment, we've broken that natural cycle of adding organics back into our soil, which is why I think we're accelerating climate change, because compost and organic matter in soil, because of all the various living organisms in there, are huge carbon sinks. So again, we are producing food, we're consuming food, and then we're throwing out the scraps, but we're not doing what nature intended us to do, or what nature does with their scraps, which is converted back into soil. That loop is essentially broken. And what I want to do is empower people to close that loop and do it in a very simple way in their own homes. So you don't have to rely on anyone else. You can just do it yourself. And I've been doing that for 4 years now. I have not sent any organic matter into landfill or into the municipal compost system. I've pretty much been building healthy soil in my own home. And because it's so easy, that I think everyone can do it, because I don't have any background in soils or farming or anything like that. I just decided to try and experiment with worms in a tub. And then a few years later, I'm still doing it, but now in slightly more better looking systems. Right, so what is vermicomposting? Essentially, it is a natural process that happens in a forest floor, where the decomposing organic matter, along with microbes and earthworms, are converted into what is called worm castings. It's basically worm poop. So the worms and the other microbes break down the food scraps, and then the worms are the apex predators in this system. So they just eat everything, and they convert that into worm castings. So worm castings are individual pieces of organic matter that are coated by the insides of an earthworm. The scraps take about 30 to 45 days to become compost. So it's one of the fastest ways to convert your kitchen or any organic matter into castings, into compost. Your typical hot composting takes about 2 to 3 weeks given the right temperature, plus 6 months to cure. Worm castings don't need any curing time, which means that as soon as you get castings in your system, or like an earthworm eats it and poops it out, you could use it in your garden or in your plants, and it's not going to affect them negatively. And the process, just like any other composting, requires oxygen, requires moisture, and a neutral pH, which means neither too acidic nor too basic. You don't really have to worry about pH so much in your home unless you are on a citrus diet. In that case, a worm bin might not be the best one for you because citrus is a bit more acidic, and it might make your system be a bit on the acidic side, and the worms don't like that. So these are the most important things to take care of: oxygen, moisture, and pH. And there's no heat generated, so your system doesn't really get hot. It maintains a regular room temperature, which is what the worms like as well. And before we get into the worms, I just want to show you what exactly happens inside a worm bin. And there's a pretty neat video that I found. Essentially, this is a cross section of the worm bin. You have at the bottom what is called bedding, which is the carbon matter. So in any composting system, you'll have a balance of food and something that's carbon rich, like paper, cardboard, or leaves. And if you don't have that balance, your system is not functional, and you're pretty much just adding food, which is not a balanced system. And a worm bin can be thought of as worms living inside their bedding, and you're feeding them your food scraps. So it's not just adding all your food in there, you're feeding the worms just like you would feed your pets. And now you notice that in the video, it started out with a lot of bedding at the bottom with the worms living in there. And then the food essentially got converted into the bedding and the castings. There's not much of a difference visually. Your food is 90% water. So what happens when the worms consume that is that the volume drops drastically. So 1 cup of food scraps that you add into your worm bin 3 weeks later is essentially a couple of tablespoons. It's or a tablespoon actually. So it's a very quick process, and because of that, you can feed them a good amount of food every other week or every time you feed them, and all of that gets the volume drops a lot. So if you've seen some of the worm bins, they're all really tiny compared to your outdoor composters. That's because the food gets digested so quickly and the moisture starts to evaporate, so you lose a lot of volume. The second thing you see in this are the earthworms. Now, there are quite a lot of earthworms in this bin. It's a mature system, which means that they can eat a good amount of food. Typically, I tend to refrain from saying how much an earthworm eats because they're living systems, they're living creatures. It would be the same as asking me how much should I feed my cat. There isn't a right number there. It really depends on, in this case, you want to make your cat a bit fat and feed it as much as they can. Earthworms, they'd love to eat food, and there's no side effects in overfeeding them as long as they're eating everything. You don't want food to start rotting in your bin. So make sure that you're feeding them how much they can eat. And we'll get to that a bit down the line. And then you see your food scraps on the top. and everything at the end of the cycle gets converted into castings. And that's basically what happens in 2 weeks when you have a worm bin. So it's a very, very rapid process. It's almost like magic when I look at my worm bin a month later, and I just see that everything has completely disappeared and it just looks like soil, and you couldn't have realized that there was food in there. Right. So coming to the actual heroes of the system, red wigglers. These are special earthworms that are not your garden variety. So you can't just pick out earthworms from the soil and put them into your worm bin. They won't do a good job in eating your scraps. Red wigglers love to live in organic matter. So they are found pretty much in the tropical countries in manure piles. So they love going through manure piles and just converting that into castings. If you use regular earthworms, there are thousands of species of earthworms. Not all of them are good at consuming organic matter. Most of them do it, but do it really slowly. I think from our experience, like our as in mankind's experience with composting with worms, they've found out that red wigglers are one of the most efficient. They can eat half their body weight in a day. So they're pretty rapid decomposers. And that's why we typically use red wigglers in our worm bins. There are a couple of other species that you can also use, but they're not as resilient as these reds. They are surface dwellers, which means that if you have 3 or 4 feet of soil and there was a manure heap somewhere there, you won't find them deep down into the soil. They tend to stay within the top 6 to 12 inches of the soil. They dislike the light. So if you shine a light on them, they'll burrow down, and they have photoreceptors on their skin, and they get paralyzed with prolonged exposure to light. So when people ask me whether their worms will spread all over their home if they decide to escape, I tell them no, they're likely going to die within like a foot of the worm bin, just because they don't like the light and they require moisture to survive because they breathe through their skins. So if you leave a worm on your table, in a few minutes it's going to shrivel up and die because that's not their environment. They require moist environments to live in. That said, worms should not be escaping your system. If they are escaping, there's something wrong inside. They love to stay in a closed environment that is rich in food and moisture. And if they want to leave that, there's something wrong. So it's a beautiful feedback system that they do give you. It's almost like a worm bin can communicate with you through that mechanism and tell you if there's something wrong. They require room temperature to live in. So the temperature that humans feel comfortable, that's what the worms also do feel comfortable in. And that's why they're optimal for indoor composting. And because they survive between 15 to 30, that's when they are their most efficient. And I think 27 or 28 degrees is where they're really the most productive. Anything below 15, between 0 degrees and 15 degrees, they will compost, but they'll be less efficient at doing so. And if it's below 0 degrees, they'll freeze and die. If it gets too hot, on the other hand, their efficiency decreases again. So in the summer when we had a heat wave in Ottawa, my apartment did not have any cooling. So the worm bin got really hot, and I noticed that they were just not composting. They would just hang in the worm bin, but they wouldn't eat anything. And our apartment was like 33, 34 degrees at that for those 2-3 days. So the worms were not liking it. They are rapid breeders. So with a small handful of worms, you can increase your population very, very quickly. And if you start out with, let's say, a handful of worms that you see in the image there, that might be maybe 50 to 70 worms. you can have them, you can increase their population by 6 times in 3 months, and 6 times of that another 3 months. They can essentially multiply, and what happens is it's an ecosystem. So the worms will multiply until there is no more room left for them to multiply, and then there is a maximum limit to how many worms can live in your worm bin. And once you've reached that limit, your worm bin has now matured, and that's when they can consume the most amount of food. And another amazing thing is that it's a natural system again, so there's no excess. So the worms won't overbreed. They will kind of just stop their reproduction and maintain a steady state in your worm bin. So you'll never face a problem that I have too many worms in my system and they're trying to escape. They just tend to balance itself out. When you start out with a worm bin, it typically takes about 6 to 8 months before you can actually see some good composting results. Just because you have to wait for that amount of time, you have to baby the worms in the early stages till they multiply and they reproduce, and then they start eating most of your scraps. So when you start out with a new worm bin, you're likely feeding them maybe 1 cup or 2 cups of food scraps a week, because you're just not starting out with like 2 to 3 pounds of worms. It's really expensive. So you'll start out with likely half a pound of worms or a quarter pound of worms or 2 or 3 handfuls of worms, and then let the system just grow. So right, what to feed them? Worms are essentially vegan. They will eat fruits and veggie scraps. That's their favorite. They can eat other things like meat and dairy, citrus, oily foods, but I would recommend adding those to only well-established systems. So if you've been running a worm bin for a year without any issues, then maybe you can be adventurous and add like a couple of bones to it, or some leftover, like some spoiled cheese. But in the beginning, don't add any of that, because what happens if you add animal products is it starts to smell. And if you don't have enough microbes inside your system, that smell, it can start to rot as opposed to decompose. So I recommend always adding fruits and veggies, eggshells, paper, coffee grounds, most of the stuff from your recycling bin, your paper stream from your recycling bin. And how much you feed them depends on a few factors. So it's always best to start out feeding them very little and then seeing how much they consume in 2 weeks, and then adding a bit more every other day. So imagine most of you are just starting out. My recommendation is 1 cup of food scraps a week. It might be too little for your worms. It might be too much. A very easy way to find out is mentally divide the worm bin into quadrants, 4 quadrants. Feed them 1 cup in the first quadrant in week 1, second quadrant in week 2, third in week 3, fourth in week 4. And when you come back to the first quadrant in week 5, you'll be able to visually see how much of the food was eaten and how much wasn't eaten. If everything was eaten, that means you can maybe make it 1.5 cup a week. So add 1.5 cup a week, and then do the same thing. And then the next week, if there's still food left, that means you have to wait for a bit more time before you can increase that 1.5 cup to 2 cups. You have to give your worm bin some time. So I started out with a handful of worms, and I would freeze all my kitchen scraps. So I'd have a lot of ice cream tubs in my freezer. So when my girlfriend would visit and she'd open the freezer, she would be, I would say, unpleasantly surprised to see that there was literally no ice cream in all those 10 boxes or so of ice cream tubs. And there was just like kitchen scraps. And she's like, why do you have only food waste in your freezer? And where's the good stuff? I would tell her, yeah, I'm on a mission to not throw anything into garbage. So I'm just saving my scraps for when the worm bin starts to eat all of it. And I noticed that it was very slow in the beginning. It was like half an ice cream tub a week. And then 3 months later, there was a sudden burst of worm activity. And I could pretty much empty out my freezer, all those 10 tubs in a month, along with what I was already giving them. So they started multiplying, and there was an exponential increase in the worms, and I could start feeding them everything. Right now in our apartment, we have 2 people, and on average, 2 kilos of food scraps a week, and all of that can go into the worm bin. If there's more, I have noticed that if I overfeed the worms, even with my established system, like if I maybe add 2 full ice cream tubs in one go, I notice that I will typically make the worms unhappy because it's just too much food for them. So I do tend to make that mistake of overfeeding. And my advice is to just feed them a limited amount of time, but more regularly. So if you have a lot of food, freeze some of it and just keep giving them bite-sized every now and then. But we'll come to that way in the future, maybe a year from now, when your system's really established and you are trying to maximize how much you give them. There is a formula for how much to feed, how to size your worm bin. I won't get too much into that, but it's about 2 kilos per square foot a week. So if you are sizing your worm bin, the best way to do it is do an analysis of how much waste you're generating, and then use this 2 kgs a square foot to determine how big of a system you need. So if you're generating 4 kgs, you need 2 square foot of surface area in your worm bin. And the best way to feed a worm bin, I don't know what you've read on the internet or what people say, because these are systems inside your home, you don't want any bugs. You don't want flies coming out of the system. If you do have it outside, you will be okay with the flies, but because we live in Canada and it's too cold to do it in the winter, you're not going to have an outdoor system. So if we were in a warmer environment, you wouldn't have to do this step because you'd be okay with a few flies every now and then. They're all natural decomposers and they help. But inside your home, you don't want any of them to come out. If they're inside the system, that's fine, but you just don't want them in your home. So the best way to feed a worm bin is always dig a hole inside your bin. You bury your food and then you cover it with fresh bedding. Like I said, bedding can be shredded paper, cardboard, or leaves, anything that's rich in carbon. Never leave food exposed on the surface, because if you leave food exposed, you're inviting fruit flies and other bugs to just enter and feed off of it. But if you dig a hole and you've buried everything nicely, they can't smell it and they're not attracted to that. And it helps to chop or blend your food scraps and then freeze them before feeding. So chopping for 2 reasons, or for 1 reason actually. Worms don't have teeth. So if you give them a big chunk of food, they have to wait for the microbes to break down that food into smaller pieces before the worms eat it, or then unless it's really mushy, and then the worms can kind of chomp down on it. But yeah, they don't have teeth. So it really helps to chop it into maybe an inch big pieces or smaller, because microbes, if you understand how microbes work, the more the surface area, the more microbes you'll have. So by chopping it or blending it, you're tremendously increasing the surface area for the microbes to start working on it. And that makes the decomposition process faster. Freezing scraps has 2 reasons. One is it kills bugs, any insect eggs that are present on the fruits and vegetables. So they won't hatch inside your worm bin, they'll just die inside your freezer. And second is it makes the food mushy. So because food is 90% water, the cell walls will get destroyed because of the freezing process, and your food becomes mushy and the worms eat it faster. So if you're doing this in your home, you need two countertop compost bins. One is the active bin that you feed your food scraps in. Once that is full, it goes into your freezer. And then the second bin comes out, and that becomes your active feeding. And you take out the one from the freezer and you feed that once it thaws into your worm bin. I cannot emphasize that the freezing is really important. There have been times where I've not frozen the food scraps and I've almost always gotten some fruit flies coming out of the worm bin. So freezing definitely useful. Hey, another cool time-lapse video here. So this is quite apt because it's Halloween season. Oh, it is pumpkin season actually. So this is a worm bin with a pumpkin getting eaten. So yeah, this is 60 days in a worm bin. That was a full pumpkin. There were a lot of red wigglers in this bin, by the way. So that's why they could eat so much of food in such a short period of time. And what I love is that you can see you can see how it almost deflates like a balloon in the very early stages. And that's because the cell walls start to break down after a few days, and then it's just that kind of pulpy mass that the worms have to start eating, and at the end you're left with just the skin, which is the hardest part for the worms to eat. But it eventually does get decomposed. Your worm bin looks like soil. That's what a worm bin should look like. All of that is a mix of bedding and castings. It is not food. So your worm bin shouldn't look like it's just got food in it, because that is inviting trouble. A worm bin should be bedding with the worms in it, and you are feeding the worms your food scraps. So if it's not the worms live in food scraps and then you're adding some bedding, it's not that. So if you just think about it as feeding the worms, you'll basically understand that a worm bin is like your pet, and you'll avoid a lot of troubles down the line because you'll tend to not overfeed them. I'll talk about that in a bit, about the number one problem that we all face in our worm bins. So talking about systems, a worm bin, a simplest container, a container is a single bin system. You can use any Rubbermaid, a wooden bin. Tent, I recommend, because these worms are surface dwellers, use a bin that has lesser depth and more surface area. So buckets aren't the best composting systems because they're deeper. Flatter Rubbermaid totes are better because they have more surface area, and so you can add more scraps to it. It's the cheapest, it's the easiest to build. You can do it almost for free. Everything stays in one container. The downside to that system though is that it's hard to harvest the castings. So it's fine for the first 3 to 6 months when you're adding your food scraps and everything. But then once the system becomes full and it's just a mix of food, worms, bedding, and castings, then it's hard to separate everything out, because the end process is to get castings from the system and continue feeding your food scraps. But once it gets full, it's really hard to get the castings out and separating it from the worms. So it's a lot of effort. I had a Rubbermaid when I started, and it was amazing for a year until it got filled. And then I was left with just this big mass of stuff that I found very difficult to manage. So what I did was I just took another Rubbermaid bin and I emptied half of the first one into the second one. So now I had 2 worm bins. I have at that, I was living alone. So I was a bachelor pad, had some more space, but I couldn't, it's not a sustainable process where you just keep splitting a bin once it gets full, right? You want to get the compost out. So I didn't get compost out of my bin for 2 years because I just kept splitting. So the second bin I gave to the neighbor after splitting it. So then she started composting, but I never got anything in return out of the bin because I just kept adding food and I never extracted. And I noticed that the bottom of a worm bin in a single system that's typically made of plastic gets too moist and sticky and becomes like clay and starts to smell a bit funky. And that happens because of because there's so much weight that the bottom gets compressed, and because the worms don't go down there, they don't like living at the bottom, so they're not digging down there and aerating the soil or aerating the castings, so it becomes a sticky mess. And that's undesirable because then it starts to breed anaerobic bacteria when there's no oxygen. Earthworms are the best. If anyone has a garden, you know that you don't have to till because the earthworms do it for you. They make the air passages, and that's what gives the roots oxygen. So if you had other worms that were deep burrowers in a worm bin, theoretically, then your bottom wouldn't get too moist. But because you're using reds, they will not go down. So an ideal bin height would be 8 inches, 8 to 12 inches. Anything deeper than that, and the bottom starts to get sticky. The second type of system are your stacking bins. So now stacking bins take advantage of the worms, of their natural movement. So the way a stacking bin works is you have 2 or 3 containers, and each of them have a mesh on the bottom. You start out with just one bin. You fill up all your food scraps, everything into just one bin. And when the bottom is full, you place the second one on top of it. And then add your food scraps and bedding into the second bin. Once the worms are done eating everything from the bottom bin, they just move up. And they move up into the second chamber because there's now fresh food there and they want to eat. So they go up there. Because there's no food left in their castings, they won't live there. They'll just move away. And then once you have your third bin, you'll notice that almost all the worms, I would say like 96 to 99% of the worms from the bottom bin have left. And now they live in the top 2 chambers. That's where the food is. So when it comes time to harvest, all you have to do is take out the bottom bin, empty it into your garden or wherever. It'll be just castings, no food, no worms. So you don't have to manually separate anything. And so then the middle 2 chambers go back into the bottom, and then empty bin goes back on the top. So you're continuously rotating the systems, and every 3 to 4 months you get fresh castings, and you don't really have to worry about separating anything by hand. So in a very small square footage, you can rapidly compost. And that's the design that I have with the worm studio. We can talk about that a bit later. But these are what stacking bins are. They're also called vertical migration systems, where the worms migrate. And then the last type are your CFTs, continuous flow through. These are more industrial systems, but they work on the same principle. The worms typically stay on the top, and at the bottom you'll have your castings, and then you scrape a layer of castings from the bottom, and you add more food on the top. So you keep continuously adding food and harvesting all in the same system. There are no layers, nothing. You need a bit of expertise to operate this because they're just bigger, much bigger systems. It'll be about 2 feet deep. Yeah, now we can take some time to ask me questions, and you can ask me in the chat or just unmute yourselves and ask.
Hi, Akil, am I saying your name correctly?
Yeah.
Yeah. Hi, Akil. I just bought a stacking bin composter, and I'm wondering when I get to the top of the 4 bins, I got 3 Coco Noir bricks with it. Sorry, 4 Coco Noir bricks with it, 1 for each tray that I prepare. I put it when I'm going to a new tray. I put in some bedding material. One of the bars broken up, make everything moist for the worms. They crawl up from the bottom bin into the next one up. What happens when I've run out of the bricks? Do I still have to keep preparing a bedding material for them? Do I have to keep buying more bricks with each tray?
You do need to be preparing bedding. But I don't use cocoa bricks. I just don't think it's necessary to use something that's processed. You can just take paper.
Okay,
take any waste newspaper, cardboard, strip it, shred it into pieces by hand, or if you have a paper shredder, and add water to it. And that's essentially your bedding. So bedding needs to have carbon, and it needs to be moist. So it's not dripping wet, but
moist like a damp sponge.
Exactly. Yeah, moist like a damp sponge. That's
Okay.
your perfect consistency.
And then my second question is, you noticed when your apartment got too warm that the worms weren't feeding very much or something. Will they die, or once it cools off to a little bit, do they go back to normal feeding?
There is a chance that some of the worms will die when it gets too hot. Yeah.
Because I don't have air conditioning in my apartment, I might be in the same have the same issue that you do.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, they will. You have to find ways to cool them. So a frozen water bottle on the top definitely helps, or inside the bin itself. Don't let the temperatures inside the bin get too hot. So don't add food when it's very hot. Just let them be. Freeze your scraps and then add them when the temperatures drop down, because your house isn't going to be that hot for most of summer. It's just going to be like that for a couple of days. Yeah. So avoid feeding them when it gets too hot.
And you're broadcasting or sending this from Kingston? I'm in Ottawa, so it'd be roughly the same temperature range, I think.
Yeah, I'm in Ottawa too.
Oh, you're in Ottawa, okay.
So roughly the same.
Okay, I'm done.
Okay, there are some questions in the chat that I'll read out. Is Isaiah? Am I saying it correctly? Might have butchered it. 2 worm bins, one with Reds and Europeans. We have 2 problems. White mite infestation due to accidentally feeding cucumber. Oh, my worms. They seem to be okay. So if you have mites feeding on your worms, that's a bad sign. If it's too wet, air holes isn't going to do anything. If your bin is too wet or too dry, you have to control moisture through the bedding. So the bedding is the key component there. If it's too wet, add a bunch of dry bedding, fluff it up. If it's too dry, then you add slightly wetter bedding, but always control moisture in a bin through the bedding. Don't water your worm bin. Don't add more air holes, so more evaporation. Worms will survive only in bedding. They're not that picky. They love food, but they will basically decompose only your paper and live there. They won't multiply as quickly. They won't be as happy, but they will eat only bedding. So if you are facing problems in your worm bin, just add a lot of bedding. You can never go wrong with that. So that's one thing. So Isaiah, if you have this problem, add more dry bedding. and just let your worm bin be for a while, and it should start to bounce back. And I won't get into too much of troubleshooting right now because most people may not even understand why you're having this problem. So you can reach out to me later and we'll discuss that. Milen's asking, we add tea, can you also add the bag and thread? If you know that the bag and the thread are not made of plastic, yeah, you can add. I know that some are, like David's tea is synthetic. So anything synthetic is not going to be eaten. Anything that's, if it's a cotton or any other blend, yeah, they will get. But be sure to see that you take out the staple from the tea bag. Sarah asks, what should we do if we accidentally overfeed the worms to correct it? And can we use all the castings as soil? So there are no risks with castings as soil. The only risk I can see is if you are a farmer and you don't want to cross contaminate your soil with maybe some seeds that have gone into the castings. But most of you aren't farmers. What happens is because there's no high temperatures, some of the contaminants like seeds don't die in your worm bin. Seeds will sprout in your worm bin, or they'll sprout one in the castings in your plants. So if you fed them tomatoes, the seeds kind of just stay in there. Worms aren't going to eat them. You may have some tomatoes sprouting in your worm bin, or you might have one or two sprouting once you use the castings in your plants. But it's not a risk. There's no health risks with that. If you accidentally overfeed your worms, spread the food in your worm bin and just add a whole bunch of bedding on top. Just dunk in like a few liters of shredded paper and cover it up nicely and just let the system be there. So if the worms don't eat it in week 1, they'll eat it in week 2, but at least you won't have bugs and stuff. Or you can just take out the extra food, and that's a bit messier to do once, like food is icky. So if you don't want to take it out, yeah, just add a whole bunch of bedding. For a family of 4, how do you know what size of bin to get? So if you have a lot of organic waste, a single worm bin is not recommended. You just won't have enough of food. You won't have enough of worms to feed your system. You might have to have 2 or 3 worm bins to consume all your waste, or maybe have an outdoor system for most of it and then some of it indoors. That's the downside of vermicomposting, which is it depends on the number of worms, and their processing capacity depends on the surface area. So if you have 4 bins, maybe 4 square foot of surface area would be the minimum. So that would be 2 worm bins, and you should be able to use both of them to process your food scraps. Can you use any type of paper? No, I don't think it's a problem. If you use, Chloe asks, you can use any kind of ink. Honestly, most of the ink is now bio-based soy ink, so it's not a problem. Just make sure that when you put paper in it, some paper is coated with plastic. So some like cereal boxes, for example, or some junk mail is coated in plastic. So that shouldn't be added into your worm bin. But inks and everything else go in, no worries. Is it necessary for making a pre-compost for citrus? So for those who don't know what pre-composting is, it's basically a partial decomposition of your food scraps before adding it into the worm bin. So it could be as simple as leave it in a container airtight, or leave it in a container for like 3 weeks, and then it starts to rot in there, and that's a pre-compost, and then you add that into the worm bin. If you're the answer to that for citrus is no. Pre-composting is still going to, you shouldn't pre-compost it because you're still going to maintain that acidity of the pH is not going to change even with pre-composting. So if you're going to put a lot of citrus, then balance it with something that is a bit more basic, like garden lime or something that's like a powdery substance. So just balance, do some chemistry, find a way to balance the pH of the system for citrus. Eggshells also work really well. No, you don't need to peel the membrane off of eggshells. So what I do for eggshells is, anybody who has gardened before will tell you that, or that eggshells take a long time to disintegrate even in your gardens. So just for aesthetic purposes, in my composting bin, I collect the eggshells separately. I just rinse it, put it in a container, and once that container is full, I grind it up and add that powder to my worm bins. So I notice that the powder gets eaten faster than whole eggshells. Whole eggshells don't get eaten, they just stay as is. It takes a long time for the calcium carbonate to decompose. So I grind it into a small powder. That's the only thing I separate out of my organic matter and process it separately, is the eggshells. How long before this video will be loaded to the website? That's something for tests.
I can get it on either by the end of the day today or sometime tomorrow.
Okay. Lynn's question is, so when you prepare the new bedding, you don't need to add soil. You can just use paper. Yeah, worms actually don't, I have never added any soil in my worm bins ever. The risk with adding soil is that you might get some insects from the outside into your home, which you don't want. So you don't need to add soil. Soil has microbes, which are beneficial, but realistically, your backyard or your front yard, the soil is not living, because just our backyards are so pumped with chemicals, or it's not sustainably managed. So where realistically we don't have a lot of bacteria and microbes in our soils. So I wouldn't recommend using soil into your worm bin. You can just use paper. Yeah, microbes are everywhere. So you give them a habitat to grow, and they will grow on your paper in your worm bin. So it just takes a bit more time. Can you put it into the basement? Yes, you can put your worm bin in your basement as long as it's temperature controlled and it doesn't get too cold. No, freezing doesn't kill seeds. I don't think it does, because I think the seed bank somewhere in Europe they cryogenically freeze the seeds for the future. So I don't think seeds can be destroyed by temperatures. Yeah, Gloria's suggestion is egg cartons are a great recycling item to include for the worms. Yeah, egg cartons are one of the nicest things to add into the worm bin because of the texture. It's already made from recycled pulp, so it's easy for the worms to decompose, and it absorbs a lot of liquids. So it's a good bedding material to add. Your worm bin should have the consistency of a sponge that you just used to wash your dishes. It shouldn't be sopping wet. Most of the worm bins that you have, if they're made of plastic, they're going to be sopping wet, and that's not good. Worms will survive in sopping wet conditions, but it just is inviting problems when it's so wet. And it's very unlikely that your worm bin will be too dry, because most people forget to add a lot of bedding, and that comes to the top rookie mistake. So by the way, there's a little bit more of a presentation to cover, so I'm gonna hold off on answering the other questions until we finish this couple of slides. So if you're starting out, don't overfeed your worms. You might think that they can eat more food, but honestly, go low in the beginning, and then over time start to see how much they eat and increase the amounts there. If you're not burying your food properly, if you've left it exposed, you will get flies. So make sure that it's always underneath a thick layer, at least 1 to 2 inches of bedding, to avoid flies. Not adding enough bedding. So the ratio is 1:1. If you're adding 1 cup of food scraps, add 1 cup of bedding. When you start out with a worm bin, your worm bin will be 3/4 filled with just bedding, only bedding. And then into that, you add your food. And just to be on the safer side, keep adding more bedding every now and then, because when you have 1 cup of food, it's easy to add 1 cup of bedding. When you're adding 10 cups of food, you often tend to forget to add 10 cups of bedding, and I'm guilty to do that. I sometimes add much lesser bedding than I should. So always add an equal amount. And the fourth one is improper moisture management. That is, again, something that most people with plastic bins have to worry about, just because plastic doesn't breathe. So it tends to hold the moisture in there. And so you have to be a bit more cautious about it then. And you'll all come across some troubles. And people that are part of the Box of Life, we've got our community for support, and I think that's one of our unique value propositions there. So you'll always have, who to reach out to. Funny thing is, most people who start out with it over time just tend to become experts. So we have there are people that are now a year into their journey, and they know as much as I do. So they love to offer their advice and help to other people. So castings, I think castings are the best fertilizer that is available, period. Nothing comes close to it. It is rich in organic matter because you've added your kitchen scraps to it. So it's got all the right balance, because we eat a balanced diet. Our scraps reflect that, and the compost that you get out of your system is the same. It's got slow release nutrients because each worm pellet or each worm casting has gone through the intestines of the worms, and they're coated in enzymes. So it's slow release nutrients. It does not add it all at once. If you add synthetic fertilizer, it's just a boost instantly, and then everything else is run off with the water. With worm castings, it's kind of dissolving slowly in your soil. The microbial content. The most important part about healthy soil is microbes, and worm castings are thriving in microbes. It's a living environment. They're like million microbes in a handful of castings, and that's what gives your plants vigor and resiliency for the long run. It's also got other stuff that I am not familiar with: plant growth hormones, humic acid, fulvic acid. This is stuff that if you're serious into growing and farming, you'll be aware of these natural hormones that help in basically faster germination, growth rate, larger root biomass. It improves stress tolerance, increasing yield, flavor profile, more leaves, larger leaves, higher chlorophyll content. So all of the good stuff just from castings. You don't need to add any other fertilizer to your plants. You simply need worm castings, unless your soil is like heavily damaged. Then maybe you have to add some more amendments. But the good part about worm castings is that you know how to make it. And if your soil is lacking phosphorus or potassium, for example, you know foods that are rich in potassium, you can add more of that into your worm bin and accordingly get that quality of castings that are rich in potassium. So I think, if I'm not mistaken, banana peels are high in potassium. So if your soil is lacking potassium, maybe you want to load up your worm bin with banana peels. And so accordingly, your castings will be a bit more rich in that mineral. So yeah, worm castings are far superior than regular compost or any other fertilizer available. And you've probably never even seen it in stores because it's so hard to, at least in Canada, it's hard to generate because you need a bigger temperature controlled facility. And if you have seen it, you probably were put off by the sticker price because it's so much more expensive than whatever item is next to it. Because worm castings are that much more valuable. When you do it at home, you just get so much of it that you will be sharing it with friends very soon. So how do you use it? It's very simple. Use it as any other fertilizer. Top dress your plants. Add just a handful of castings to any of your plants every now and then. if you're repotting something, 20% is the ideal ratio of castings to other stuff like potting soil. Anything more than 20% and you won't see any incremental benefits. Anything less than 20%, you will see lesser benefits to the growth of your plants. And my favorite way is making worm tea. So what I do is I take 2 handfuls of castings, I put it in about a liter of water, and I keep stirring it every now and then for a day. Then I sieve out the solids, and the liquid that I have is now a liquid fertilizer that has the microbial content and some of the nutrients, and I water my plants with that. So those are the 3 ways to use castings. And a little, just a pinch of castings, I would say, has so much microbial life that it can rejuvenate any plant. So you don't have to load up on castings. A little goes a long way. And yeah, if you want to build your own bin, you just need a shallow container, you need some bedding, and you need worms. Put them in shade and in that temperature range, and you've got a worm bin. It's as simple as that. It doesn't have to be overly complicated. You don't need fancy systems to start out with. Fancy systems definitely help because they make your life easier. And we're so busy nowadays that I think something that I like to approach vermicomposting or composting as a habit in my life that I spend a couple of minutes every week on. I don't actively see this as a chore. I don't want people to spend time and feel like it's overburdened or feel like they're overburdened with a new set of pets in their home. No, 2 minutes is all you need a week. Anything more than that and you're indulging the worms, which is fine. I mean, I'm not complaining. They are buddies at the end of the day. So that is my 101. This is also, by the way, the Worm Studio, which is a stacking vermicomposter that I make out of wood, so it breathes really well, which is why we don't really have any concerns with moisture. And also, if you notice, there's no collection tray at the bottom, because what you get, the liquids that come out of a worm bin is not worm tea, it's worm leachate. There's a big difference. Leachate is undesirable and is often a byproduct, negative byproduct. With a wooden worm bin, our system breathes really well, and we put a bit more emphasis on moisture management through bedding. So that's why we've eliminated an entire chamber for collection of these liquids, because there are no liquids that you get. So your worm castings are going to always have that moist consistency without being sticky. And if you want to reach me, my website is theboxoflife.com. I'm also on a couple of social media channels, Instagram and Facebook, and that's my email. If you ever have to ask me any questions or want to know more about what we do or want to participate and help out, because our mission is huge. It's basically changing lifestyles and behavior change at the individual level. So if you would like to help, I could use it. Also, I'm trying to make bigger systems for offices and cafes. So if you have any ideas on some areas that would be potential sites for these type of pilot projects, let me know by email. And I am okay to stay for a few more minutes. So if you have more questions, let me pull up the chat. And you can ask me there or just unmute yourselves. So Heather asks, how long can you leave the system alone for if you go on vacation? We've left them alone for a month, and they were fine. We noticed that the worm populations did drop because there wasn't a lot of food that was added. But as long as you ensure that they've got food and moisture, the worms will survive. So right now we're on vacation for a week, and the worms I didn't even bother doing anything. I just left them. All right, so I guess that's it. We're tapped out on questions. What kind of help am I looking for? Right now, we're trying to raise more awareness about the process of vermicomposting. So any kind of networking with organizations like Sustainable Kingston, we reach a wider audience. And I encourage everyone to at least try it, right? Just get a handful of worms, get a small container, and try composting. And if you are composting, or if you're doing anything, actually, forget compost. If you're doing anything that's sustainability oriented, that maybe other people don't know about, don't be afraid to talk about it. I used to be very reluctant to talk about this to my friends because I'm like, I don't want to show off, or I don't want to maybe bore them. But then I realized after doing it professionally that people are really interested in this, and they want to hear more, and they want to know more about how they can help basically create a more resilient and healthier future. Because with lesser waste going to landfill, you are improving our planet. So people want to know how to do that. And I feel like a worm bin in your home is just a very simple individual action that you can take. So talk about it. Talk about your composting adventures, and don't be that person that keeps talking about just one thing. I also tend to not just keep talking about composting, but yeah, just put it in a conversation every now and then. Tell people that it's normal to have earthworms in your house. It's not something that's just so out of so far out that they'll think you're a weirdo. So Gloria, best way to retrieve castings for prep to make worm tea. I think your question was how to get castings out of a system for worm tea, or to remove the castings from the worm tea. I just use a strainer. I don't tell my wife that I use her kitchen strainer, or our kitchen strainer rather, but I do use it, and then I wash it nicely so she doesn't realize that it was used for that purpose. But yeah, any kind of tea strainer or stocking to separate the solids from the liquids. You've told everyone about your new bin. Perfect. Now you need to just keep telling them or showing them that it's something you do. It's just a part of, it's a routine. It's a habit in our house. We don't throw any food into garbage, and we don't think twice about putting it into the worm bin. It's just something like you brush your teeth in the morning, you wake up, you don't really think about doing it, right? You just do it. So it took us a few years to reach that point where it became a habit. But once it's a habit, you're not going to change it. It's awesome to have someone from CA, I'm assuming, is California and not Canada. So Chula Vista. Gloria, thank you so much for joining us. Always a pleasure or envy actually, to hear from people who are in warmer climates that can do this outside all year round. But good luck if you are starting out. I'm always here to help, and the internet is also there to help. So don't be disheartened if you come across some problems. Just stick to it, and the worms will respond accordingly. Yeah, great. So thanks everyone for joining me, and I hope you've learned something new. I do understand it's a lot of knowledge, just information for one day. So take what you can out of this, and do your own research. It took me 4 months of research before I started my first worm bin. And it definitely does help. Like, I wished there was somebody I could talk to help me through this. And I would like to provide that opportunity to people right now. So if you have any questions, suggestions, or comments, let me know later on. And I'm always happy to hear from you.
Thank you so much. I know I learned a lot, and clearly you answered many, many questions. So yeah, I think we're just gonna wrap up, but this will be posted in the next day or two. Yeah, thank you again. Have a great rest of the week, everyone.
Bye, everyone. Take care. All right. So I'm also going to hop off then. See ya, Jeff.